To go get something to eat?
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Let's eat!
Hi, welcome to Hunt and Gather with the Chatters. Today we're going to go through the basics of trout fishing, and it's kind of a high-level view for a beginner, but we will get specific enough that even if you're a seasoned veteran, you could possibly find use in this video. So, you ready to go learn something neat? I do got to give you a warning. If you employ these methods, you will be successful. And fishing is just incredibly addictive. So basically your job is at stake here. If you employ these methods, you're going to be catching fish. And I don't know what relationship you're in, but hopefully it's not a very good one, because you'll just want to be at the lake all the time. And so I don't know how many sick days you have, and I don't know how close you are to divorce, but just keep that in mind before you go any further in this video. The first thing you're going to need is a rod and reel. And my favorite rod and reel for most lake fishing and stream fishing is one of these Zebco 33s. They're inexpensive, they're super easy to cast. I feel like they last pretty well. And so in my mind, they're the way to go. But bottom line is, you're going to want a rod and reel that you can put 6-pound test on. For trout, they are a little bit line shy. So if you have too heavy a line, like let's say you had 12 or 15-pound test line, it can kind of scare them from biting. But 6-pound test is small enough that it seems to work well, and yet stout enough that you can reel in a good sized fish if you have your drag set right. If you're going to use the same pole for trout and bass and even catfish, like 8-pound test isn't a bad bet either. That works pretty good for all those species. But if you're only going to fish for trout, 6-pound test. Your line, you should replace it every 2 years, no matter what, and possibly more often if you're going fishing frequently, because it'll get scarred up, every time you're dragging across rocks. The other thing I do is every trip I go out, I'll take the last 2 feet of my line and cut it off and throw it in the trash, because the last 2 feet of your line has been scraped on rocks and stuff very often, and so it's very weak. You don't have to buy an expensive fishing line, but I am a fan of the monofilament rather than the braided line. If I was only going to fish for catfish, I'd use the braided line. They don't seem to be scared by fishing line. In fact, I'd use heavy line. But trout and even bass, they kind of get scared by line sometimes. So I like the clear monofilament, but I usually buy the cheapest line I can find. This is Zebco line at Walmart. Works great. Make sure you store your fishing rods outside of the sunlight, and ideally where it doesn't get too hot or cold. So we store ours in the house in a closet, so they don't receive any sunlight from the window, and they don't ever get really hot or really cold, and the line lasts a long time that way. First, let's talk about bait fishing. One of the most common trout baits out there is what they call Powerbait. So for that, you would want to use a small hook. This is even a little bit on the large end, but you want to hook about the size of a frozen pea. And then, personally, I like the pink color, but they got a lot of different colors, and a little bit of glitter isn't a bad thing. When you do put your trout bait on there, it's basically a dough bait. You want to put just enough bait where it just barely covers the hook, but the hook's almost poking through. Okay, so you put just enough bait on there to cover the hook, but where the barbs are almost poking through. And so that's how the power bait works. Okay, and then for worm fishing, you'll want to use just a regular bait holder hook, they call them, size 8 or even size 10. And let's talk about this for a second. My favorite way to fish for trout is to bait fish with a worm. I apologize, I don't have an actual worm with me right now, but you'd want to use a night crawler, kind of medium size, so about that big right there. And if you use a size 8 hook, it's very appropriate for bass, trout, crappie, catfish, walleye, everything. And pretty much any fish that swims in fresh water likes to eat a worm. So I highly encourage you to fish with live night crawlers because even though you're trying to fish for trout, you're probably not against reeling in some other fish. And so the way we do our worm rig is we tie on our hook at the end. And after you tie on your hook, you want to be sure to clip the tail pretty close to the line. So there's just a little bit hanging out to keep it from untying. And then you use a number 4 split shot about 14 inches away. So this is a number 4 split shot. And then what you're going to do is your worm, there's a head to it that's a little bit darker. You'll hook your worm about that far down from the end. So very close to the end, just about a ½ inch in, just one time. And then you'll come back to this last third, and this is called a worm blower. You'll insert it into the worm inside the body cavity, and you'll squeeze air into the worm, just usually one squeeze, and that slightly inflates the worm so that he'll float. So then what happens is when you cast your line out, your sinker sets on the bottom of the lake, but your worm floats up like this, and then that worm will just be squirming that whole time while it's sitting there. And so this does a couple things. It makes it very visible for the fish, because a lot of fish are swimming towards the bottom and they can see that worm squirming around because it's not just laying down underneath the rocks. And then also it makes it less likely that you'll get snagged in brush and stuff because it's hanging up above it. So that's how we rig up a worm rig. And that's actually what we use for bass a lot of times, catfish, everything. But it is important that you hook them on the end so that you get that full squirming action. A lot of people hook their worm in the middle, which if you're just fishing for catfish, it's okay, although it's still not better than this. And anyways, you'll have a lot of success with this. Please try it. It's one of the best things ever. The other thing you can do though is sometimes in the morning and evenings the fish are real active on the top of the water. So you might use a bobber. So I like these stick bobbers. So I'll put my stick bobber about 3 feet away from my hook. And then I'll use a little bit smaller weight, like maybe a number 5 or a number 7 weight, kind of in between my bobber and the hook. And so that just makes sure that and you won't want to blow the air up with, you won't want to blow the worm up with air if you do that, because you want the worm to hang down and sink below the bobber. The stick bobbers are great because there's very little resistance when they go to pull down, so the fish doesn't pull hardly any resistance at all, which makes it want to bite over and over again. And so I'm definitely a fan of the stick bobbers. But what you'll do after you rig your line up and you've got your worm inflated and all that, you'll cast it out in the lake. And I encourage you to try to cast it as far as you can cast, without applying too much pressure to the worm. And then if you don't get a bite within an hour, maybe try a cast that's half that distance. Or if you in a state where you can do 2 poles at once, then try one out as far as you can cast and one about half the distance that you can cast. That way you got them in different depths, and whichever depth seems to be hitting, you might switch the other rod over to that depth. But once you get your line casted out there, it's tempting to want to hang on to that rod. The problem with that is when you get a bite, you kind of have a tendency to jerk right away. And when you're fishing with bait, whether it be power bait or a worm, typically they'll kind of peck at it at first, but they don't really have the hook in their mouth. And so you don't really want to set the hook right away. You want to wait till that second bite, and they'll bite again, and you'll even feel a long, steady pull. And during that long, steady pull, that's when you want to set the hook, because then you know they've got that hook in their mouth. So the better method is to leave your line sitting out there, and you'll prop it up just on some rocks or your tackle box, about an angle like that. So I want my line to just have a slight dip with a little bit of coil in it. And what that's going to do is when a fish comes and bites my worm or my power bait, it's going to allow them to pull it with very little resistance, because they're not actually pulling against the rod yet, for a few feet before they feel the rod. Because sometimes when they feel the tension of the rod, they'll let go and they won't come back and bite again. And so you want them to be able to pull it a few feet without any tension. And then you don't want to have to just sit there and stare at your line all day long. You know, you kind of want to sit down and enjoy the beauty of the lake. And so these bells are worth everything. You'll hook that bell between the first and second eyelet. You want to make sure your line isn't going through the bell. And you'll let it dangle like that. And then when you get the slightest little bite, that bell will ding. And so it'll alert you to it. You can even reel in a fish with the bell still attached. Or if you don't want to drive your neighbors crazy, you can take the bell off. The other thing you can do that works good, or sometimes I even do it with the bell, is I'll take a bobber and just add a blank hook to the end of it there. And then what I'm doing is I'm making it so that my line now is tight, which is nice because it doesn't spook the fish. But yet, when the fish starts grabbing it, all it's going to do is slightly pull up that bobber. There's not much resistance on it, so you want it to be a small bobber. But when you see that bobber being pulled, you'll know you got a bite. And in fact, you can even watch that bobber, and you can wait till it's just slowly being pulled up. And it's being pulled for a few seconds, but it's still actively being pulled, and then you can set the hook. So these are great. So be sure to check your regulations. Some lakes and creeks and rivers and whatnot don't allow you to use bait, which is a testament to how effective bait fishing is. It's a way to lower the catch rate at a particular place if they only allow you to use lures. It's also sometimes a little more easy to release a fish that was caught on a lure than bait. So make sure it's legal to use bait where you're fishing. And if you can use a 2-pole stamp, I highly encourage it. Something that's good to do is you'll put power bait on one pole and a night crawler on another if you're fishing for trout. Or again, just a night crawler on each pole so that you have maximum opportunity for any fish in the lake. Throw one out as far as you can cast, throw one half as far. Or what a lot of people do is they'll throw one pole out with their bait on it and the bell, and then they'll fish in the general vicinity, just 10, 20 feet away with a lure, and they'll be casting that lure over and over in different spots while that bait pole is also working for them. Because on any given day, you never know what's going to be the thing that's working best. When I'm bait fishing, I'm looking for a certain shoreline. If I'm standing at the water's edge and it barely tapers out there, then I know when I throw that bait as far as I can, it's probably sitting in 3 feet of water. Again, it's not impossible to catch a fish that way, but it's not a likely spot. I'm looking for a shoreline that maybe has like a 20-degree slope. So maybe something like that. Somewhere in that range. And then when I throw my bait out and let it sink down on the bottom, my bait ideally is setting in water that's anywhere from 5 feet at the shallowest to 20 feet at the maximum depth for trout. And actually, that's somewhat true for bass and even catfish and most fish species. You know, if you go out in the middle of a lake and it's 100 feet deep and you drop your line down on the bottom, hopefully you have a nice book to read or something, because you're probably not going to get any action. And likewise, if you're fishing in 2 feet of water, it's just not where the majority of that fish's food is normally found, and so they're not going to be there. So that's something to keep in mind with bait fishing. With lure fishing, you typically are able to throw the lure pretty far. So again, I wouldn't want to be sitting in a shoreline that's totally level, but it's okay if it's fairly steep. It's okay if it's fairly flat. If it's real flat, though, you're going to constantly be getting snagged. With trout, it seems like you're not looking for vegetation structure. Like you don't, you know, if you were bass fishing and you saw a submerged log, you definitely want to fish around it heavily. But for trout, it's not necessarily attracted to them. What does seem to be attractant in my mind is what the lake bed looks like. They're not necessarily looking for just a sandy lake bed, nor are they looking for a lake bed that's just giant rocks everywhere. Plus, it's problematic bait fishing where there's giant rocks. But if you can find an area of the lake that has that 20 to 30 degree tilt, and then it's mostly a sandy, muddy bottom, but it has a fair amount of rocks that are the size of your fist or smaller, there's going to be a lot of fish there. And there's probably the occasional bigger rock. That's the ideal scenario. The fish will be loaded up in there for trout, and that's where you want to fish. Now let's talk about lures. So you'll want to use a swivel with most types of lures. A lure has an action to it, and it kind of wobbles or spins, and it's constantly trying to twist your line, and so the swivel keeps your line from being twisted. But it also does something else. It makes it real easy to switch lures. You just unsnap it, you don't have to untie your line, and you hook on a different lure. And so if one lure is not working, you know, if you fish for an hour and a half with one lure and you don't get any strikes, I would switch lures. My favorite lure for trout is what they call a spoon. And these spoons are fairly small. You know, as a general rule with trout, you want to go small on your lures. This is probably like 1.5 inches long, this spoon. And the nice thing about a spoon is it's got a fair amount of weight, so you can throw it way out in the lake, and so you're covering a lot of range. The other thing is they're very cheap because they're a very simple lure, but don't let it fool you. They're very effective. I believe they're maybe the most effective lure against a trout. And so brand doesn't matter. Buy the cheapest spoon you can get that is that basic shape, and there's all kinds of different colors because lure manufacturers are really trying to appeal for the fisher, not the actual fish. But straight silver is hard to beat. And so I go with straight silver. But some other similar lures that work great for trout, rooster tails, they've been around forever. They have a blade that spins around as you're reeling them in. They work great. Panther martins also work really well. Z-rays are excellent. There's the classic copper color with the red dots, which is excellent. This frog pattern, though, actually works surprisingly well. And then a Super Duper is also a great lure. I like this color right here, the nickel with just the red tip. And then a couple that aren't really in the metal family, flatfish. Actually, let me say one more thing about these metal type lures. Once the fish clamps onto them, they're going to instantly know it's not real and they're going to want to let go. So because of that, you want to retrieve them at a fairly fast pace, anywhere from medium to fast. So I'll throw it out and then I'm reeling like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They also have a lot of weight to them, so if you reel them too slow, they go down to the bottom. But they also need a fairly fast retrieve so that their action works good. And so that's important to fish them medium to fast. This guy here, he's a little different. He's called a flatfish. He's made out of plastic. You'll throw him out and then you'll reel him pretty slow, like 1, 2, 3. And you'll watch his body and it's just doing this as he's coming in. I touted the silver color as being the best, but when it comes to flatfish, I believe this frog color, the black and green, is the best. Sometimes flatfish are so lightweight that sometimes what I'll do is I'll take one of my split shots. And you also don't want to use a swivel with flatfish. You just want to tie the line directly to it. But I'll add a split shot about 3 to 4 feet away, far enough away that the split shot doesn't spook the fish. And that enables me to get a little bit of extra weight where I can throw it out there. And also it gets the flatfish down a little ways. Maybe the fish are 4 to 5 feet below the surface as opposed to right on top. I'll do the same thing with these little curly tail grubs. These are little 2-inch curly tail grubs. I like the white color. And you just tie your line straight to it. You don't want to use a swivel. And then you may or may not add a split shot to it. But same thing on these here, you'll retrieve them at a slow to medium pace. Kind of like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They have a soft body, so sometimes the fish will hit them repeatedly. And you can also purposely throw them out and let them sink a long time to where you think they're near the bottom, and then slowly reel them in. So they're pretty versatile that way. The other nice thing about them is bass love them, crappie love them, so you never know what you're going to catch. Okay, when you're lure fishing, let's just say you have this spoon on there. What I like to do is, first of all, so we're clear, a lure that's not being reeled in is not doing anything for you. Like, a fish is never going to swim up to a lure just sitting there and grab it. It just looks like a piece of trash to them if it's not moving. And so you have to be moving it. But what I like to do is I like to throw one cast out straight away from the bank, as far as I can throw it. And then I reel it in. And then the next cast I throw will be 45 degrees. So if this is the lake shore and this is straight out, I'm throwing it 45 degrees. So what I'm doing is I'm throwing it out as far as I can, but it's never as far from shore as the other cast is. Sometimes the majority of the fish are hanging closer to shore. And that other cast I'm doing, I'm purposely throwing it towards the wind. So if the wind's blowing this way, I want to throw it at a 45 degree angle that way. The reason is, a majority of the time, the fish are facing the wind. There's a current coming and they're facing towards the current. And then what I'll do is, after I make a couple casts that way, I'll walk down the bank, 15, 20 feet and do it again. Throw one out in the lake, reel it in, throw it a 45 degree angle, reel it in. And ideally, you just have a little fanny pack on you that has a bottle of water and some of your favorite lures, maybe some of your favorite baits. And you're able to just travel around that lake because you never know where they're going to be hitting. There's always a hot spot around that lake on any given day. And you don't want to burn the whole day where they're not at. So let's talk about best places to fish for trout in Arizona. There's some creeks and streams, and I didn't really cover the method for fishing those. I mean, you can throw lures in them. You can throw your line out and let it sit if you find a pool in the stream, but there's other methods that you would use if you were actively fishing the current. So let's talk about lakes, though, because that's kind of what we're talking about here. When you lake fish in Arizona, if you're in the Williams area, I highly encourage you to go to Dogtown Lake or Kaibab Lake. Those are great. If you're in the Flagstaff area, Ashurst is great. And if Lower Lake Mary filled up that year because we got enough snowmelt, it's a really hot spot too. And then if you're over in the eastern part of Arizona, like White Mountains and whatnot, Woods Canyon Lake is good. Willow Springs Lake, near the Sholo area, Sholo Lake is really good. And then if you go a little bit farther, like Big Lake is a real good one. Those are probably my favorite lakes in Arizona to trout fish. And some of those lakes have bass too, so keep that in mind if you're going to worm fish. And some of them have catfish. Most of these lakes are free to get into. You just park your car and go down there and enjoy your fishing. Most of them have campgrounds. They usually have restrooms and whatnot. So, you know, they're just great all around. You'll see a lot of people during the summertime, and it's okay. You can distance yourself from them. I definitely wouldn't want to be right in the middle of the group, because the idea is if fish are swimming through, they probably already encountered someone else's presentation before they got to your line. So you'd want to be on one of the ends. But better yet is to walk a little bit farther and find a piece of shoreline that's yours, you know. The best times to fish lakes in Arizona for trout is April to September. They start stocking the northern Arizona trout lakes in April, and then they stock them all the way through August. And there's also the holdover trout that have just existed in the lake for a year or more, and so those are really big sometimes. But the other issue is if you go early in the year, the water temperature is so cold, the fish just aren't that active. And so right around April, like mid-April or so, is when the water temperature is getting just warm enough that the trout are starting to get active. And my favorites like April and May and June, because that's the first part of the season when the majority of the stockers are still in the lake and you still have a chance to catch them. The majority of the holdover trout have not been fished out yet. And so it's just a magic time of year. The other thing I'll say is there's certain times of day that are best. I believe the morning hours and evening hours are the best for most types of fish, including trout. Trout are notoriously not a night biter. I'm not saying no one's ever caught one at night, but I wouldn't spend my time doing it. But it's worth your time to set your alarm, get to the lake when the sun's barely cracking, and fish those first few hours in the morning. The exception might be when the weather's really cold. Sometimes the middle of the day is pretty good. And then, of course, there's just when you can get out there. And again, the bobber fishing is usually more prominent in the morning or evenings when the fish are cruising around the lake looking for food. In the middle of the day, they're typically on the bottom. But again, anytime you got the day off work, that's the best time. You can even go out ice fishing. I mean, it's never a waste of time. It's always good. Okay, so hopefully that gets you started into trout fishing. And if you want additional resources, we have a lot of videos in the Hunt and Gather with the Chatters line where we are trout fishing or fishing for bass. And, you know, a lot of those videos show more of the live presentation at the lake and more specific what we're doing. And we got videos on how to fillet fish out, how to cook them. So those are great resources as well. But hopefully this gets you started and motivates you to get out there. And that's the main thing. Get out there and enjoy it. So thanks for watching Hunt and Gather with the Chatters. We'll see you next time when we go get something to eat. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. It helps us out and it's totally free.